I've always been intrigued by the philosophical or existential threads in some religious writings, but the beliefs part of it never made any sense to me and still doesn't. The community part of our religion, which has turned out to be the most compelling to me of all, well, I'm not even sure I was aware of its existence as a young man. In 1990, I met my wife, Anne, who had come to Quakerism after rejecting the Catholicism of her childhood. I decided to tag along to the meeting where she had been a member for several years. Right off the bat, I was drawn to the practice of silent worship. I barely grasped the importance of the communal part of that silence, though I could tell it was quite different from sitting silent by myself. As a sometimes poet, I found compelling language and images rising in my mind with an unusual frequency in the midst of worship. This made me panic because I knew I wouldn't be able to remember them long enough to write them down. I started bringing a notebook, and some of my fondest poems were born in worship during my first year at meeting. Here's one of those. It's called Shh. All our threads spindle upward together, a yarn immeasurable and tenuous as prayer into swirl of sky like breathing marble. Immaculate, and human misery finds its forgotten heart. Tears fall like magnesium fire in dark water. The drowning flame murders us. Shh. Your eternally open mouth is a garden for birds. They weave nests of sweet grass behind your eyes. Their wings flutter alive, the illusion of vision, the world you think you know. You swear it is all there. Stone, wood, flesh, the cruel architecture of time. Trust your breath. The world is a resonance of wings. I discovered a problem with bringing a notebook to meeting, though. The more addicted I got to these images, epiphanies, and insights, the more I tended to resent it when someone spoke. Especially if what they said seemed silly or disagreeable to me. They were interrupting my silence. Anyway, I found that worship doesn't work so well in a spirit of resentment, so I gave up the notebook. Over time, I've gotten to the point where I welcome and value most of the messages I hear in worship. Sometimes I value the ones I disagree with even more than the ones I agree with. From the beginning and to this day, I'm not a person who loves to be part of a group. I don't like to be at the center of attention, so here I am. I don't like to have things expected of me. I particularly don't like to conform my thoughts or decisions to what any person or group expects of me. My early involvement with friends was on my own terms, and although I've moved somewhat away from that early tendency, it's still very much part of who I am. I'm not ashamed of that, though it sometimes is an uncomfortable way to be. I hear a lot of criticism of individualism in Quaker circles. Such criticism touches on something important, I think, but it misses the mark. A Quakerism or a culture that does not wholeheartedly honor the value and distinctiveness of the individual cannot create community of much depth or genuineness. Building community and unity of a sort is absolutely central to being a Quaker. But that unity is in dynamic relationship, not in stasis. We can and must listen to and learn from one another, even allow ourselves to be changed if that is how Spirit moves us. But that doesn't mean sacrificing our various worldviews and adopting a ready-made theology that doesn't make sense to us. About a year after I started attending, my wife and I asked for a clearness committee for marriage under the care of the meeting. Some friends on that committee struggled with my atheism, not directly, but around my unwillingness to use traditional friends' language in our vows. That is, in the presence of God and these our friends, I take thee to be my wife, promising with divine assistance to be unto thee a loving and faithful husband as long as we both shall live. They're lovely vows, but coming out of my mouth, they would have been lies. At some point I said, listen, I've told you where I am. We've told you where we are as a couple. Our vows are not a problem for us, and you need to decide if they're a problem for you. They decided, and we were married under the care of the meeting. I personally have a hard time understanding why anybody gets married any other way. Quaker weddings are the best. The real clincher that brought me wholeheartedly into Quakerism came when my wife got pregnant and terribly, gravely ill. A then undiagnosed autoimmune illness led to preeclampsia, toxemia, a terrifying psychotic depression, and very nearly her death until the pregnancy was terminated to save her life. During those agonizing days and weeks while I was almost living at the hospital, friends whose names I didn't know were caring for our daughters, calling special meetings for worship, bringing meals to me, sitting with me while I fell apart. In the months after that experience, though I still didn't understand how a person like me could be a Quaker, it dawned on me that whatever the conflicts and contradictions between us, these are my people. Within a year, this realization prompted me to ask for a clearness committee for membership. We talked a bit about my atheism on that committee, but there wasn't the slightest hint that it might be a barrier to being a friend. I do remember one dear elderly woman on the committee telling me, "You believe in God, you just don't know it yet." She was a lovely, generous-hearted woman, and I wasn't the least bit offended, but I had to say, no, you're wrong. Almost a decade later, after I'd become more and more known in my meeting as an out atheist, I gave a high school friend a ride home after a committee meeting. He had learned that I was an atheist and shared that he was as well. He further shared that he had often been told that without belief in God, a person couldn't be moral. This was hard for him to hear, and hard for me to hear from him as well. I thought, this will not stand. This must be challenged. Young friends should not have to struggle with such thoughts on their own in silence. This led me to the idea of starting a discussion group in my meeting called Quakers Without God, which I formed in 2002. With a hiatus of a couple of years, we've been meeting monthly ever since, sometimes just a handful of us, at times a dozen or more. I didn't want to damage or wound the community with the group, and for that reason I spent time with a Christian friend in our meeting who I had asked to serve as my elder before moving forward with the first announcement. It read, "Quakers Without God. I would like to form a discussion group of friends of all ages whose faith may not extend to God or the supernatural. Are our beliefs irrelevant, or might they contain something of value to our beloved religious community? Are we hiding? Can we speak our truth?" The group has been wonderful. Some of the richest conversations I've ever had were among these friends at these gatherings. Sometimes the discussion has been directly related to belief and unbelief. More often it has not. At least as much as the nominal topic of the group, I've valued spending time with a group of people who are comfortable wrestling with ideas in a vigorous manner that I find is often frowned upon in my meeting. Nobody at Quakers Without God has ever said, "We're getting too much in our heads here," and I'm grateful for that. I had never heard the term non-theist at the time I formed the group, and in a way I'm glad of that. I think that term was chosen, at least partly, because of a lot of friends don't know what it means. I like that people know what Quakers Without God means, even though we don't quite know what God means. Years after the group was founded, the young Fred who inspired me to launch it told me that before attending the group, he had never believed he was a spiritual person. After hearing from so many clearly spiritual people who had come to our gatherings, he learned that he was spiritual in his own way, that one can be spiritual without believing in God. At the same time, I was a bit uncomfortable with becoming known as the face of godlessness in my monthly and yearly meeting. For the first year or so, I could hardly go to a potluck or other social gathering without having to answer the question, what do you mean, Quakers Without God? Some who asked were interested in possibly coming to the group. Some were merely curious in a friendly way. Some were curious in a challenging way, and one or two were seriously troubled by the whole concept. Many of those conversations were rewarding for me, and I think good for the community, but it did get exhausting sometimes. Some of that discomfort comes from the fact that my non-theism is not all I am as a person or as a member of the community. I do work for the meeting. I spend time with friends for the pure pleasure of their company. I serve on committees for care, support, and clearness, leaving my theological notions behind as necessary to serve the needs of the person for whom the committee was formed. I look forward to a time when the idea of giving a talk about being a non-theist among friends seems pointless because nobody thinks taking such a position is impossible or antisocial. A significant part of the group's value, I think, accrues to people who never show up. The simple existence of such an item in our announcement sheet, sometimes alongside another announcement for Friends of Jesus. And this was actually the person who was my elder as I was forming this group. A year or two later formed the Friends of Jesus group in our meeting, which I thought was just lovely. So that seeing those announcements side by side is a comfort for those who feel the sting of unspoken or dishonored difference. I remember the time a young transgendered friend spoke a message in worship saying essentially that reading those two contrasting announcements side by side in our announcement sheet made him think, maybe this is the kind of place where even someone like me can find a home. That moved me. At the time I formed Quakers Without God, I had never been to the FGC annual gathering and had no idea there was a national or international organized group of Quaker non-theists that had workshops, a website, and an email list. I first went to that gathering in 2004 and attended the Non-Theism Among Friends workshop. This was another eye-opener for me. My own meeting had been, not perfectly, but overwhelmingly supportive and open toward me. And theological diversity was and remains a fundamental characteristic of our community. I learned that others attending the workshop felt similarly about their home meetings, but many had had a terribly difficult time of it. Some were isolated, afraid, and reluctant to speak out. Some had been challenged and even insulted again and again. One longtime friend who had grown up in a meeting was read out of membership in that meeting for being an outspoken unbeliever. Read out of meeting is a common phrase in the U.S. for disownment in the U.S. Bravely, she stayed engaged in the community and was read back into membership some years later with a heartfelt apology from the meeting for the admitted mistake of reading her out. This story is in the book Godless for God's Sake, edited by our friend David Bolton.